Welcome to the channel. Today, let's talk about astrology and the subconscious. How can we use astrology to learn about ourselves and the general subconscious that we can share certain archetypes and patterns with other people around us and all over the world? I'm Esso and we'll talk about spirituality and astrology. If you enjoyed the content, leave a like and subscribe, and let's get into business. First, we have to understand that our alignments represent our major spiritual natures. We can identify and organize them using planets, Mars, Venus, right? But how does the planets tell us anything about our spiritual nature? How do we know what planets represent what? Those conclusions, though, come from two perspectives: a spiritual perspective and the human perspective. On the spiritual perspective, planets or stars, both of them are this concept but represented in different ways, they are big accumulations of spirits. So they are very big groups of spirits. If they came all together in the same space, it means they are sharing something, certain characteristics, certain desires. They were attracted to that space, or their travel went into that space, so they share something in common. And because we know that they share something in common, we can then organize them and archive them, archetype them, and we can identify those different natures, those different spiritual perspectives. We then can create words to then between ourselves relate to spiritual natures. But how do we know what spiritual natures, for example, Venus represents? Well, that comes from our spirit as well, because we all spirits, no thing, no shape or form, not the creation. We are all creators, so we understand what other spirits do. We might not be able to understand fully because our spirit might not be able to withstand, or just our spirit might not be aware to the full extent. But if we can see it, if you can feel it, and if there is a whole body of language talking about certain planets across different cultures in similar ways, we can come to the conclusion that we have certain information about that. And then that's where the human perspective comes in, because then, as humans from different cultures, people wrote similar texts, similar descriptions and attributes to those planets. So that means that we gained conscious, and we were able to bring sense and logic to those spiritual natures. So we here kind of have to trust our own spiritual natures. We can't prove in a scientific way that Venus and Saturn and Mars represent this or represent that or influence us in a specific way. We really need to go with the fact that a lot of cultures, different cultures around the world, speak about these planets and these alignments in similar ways. And when we go into astrology and we are already spiritual, we already know the basis, those things make sense. And then when we study us, or in my case, also others' natal charts, I just keep coming into contact with similar notions with these alignments. Repetition of cases where people have certain alignments in same positions or oppositions, and I can draw some conclusions from that. So if planets are big groups of spirits and we can identify the space, the spirits, and the creations that those spirits are creating from those specific spots, we can attribute them categories and attributes. And then you have to understand another spiritual factor, which is the creation of our body and mind. We live in the solar system, in the Milky Way galaxy, right? But specifically to our system, that's the most relevant to us. For example, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they are only co-rulers because they are kind of far away already. So beyond that point, things don't really affect us as much. So they are not as important or relevant at all. So in the solar system, we have mainly 8 chakras, but we see 7 because we live in one of them, the Earth. And then technically, there are 10, but Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto already too far away. So the 7 chakras that we have is the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So 7 chakras. And in many cultures, we also have 7 chakras. I came to the conclusion that when we come here as a spirit to create our body and mind, we use those big chakras, those big accumulations of spirits as an example. So we already carry the same traits of the being that we live in, because we live inside of another being. Like we have beings living within you, we also live inside of another being. But it's nothing like we see in the real world. It's a being beyond our comprehension, because if it was not, we wouldn't be living within it. We'll be living around it, and we'll be able to understand it like we understand cats and dogs, for an example. And we know that we live inside of a being or something that is alive because of the movements and the shifts in the planets and in moral, social constructs, and all those things that we see the world going through. So we know we live inside of a system, inside of a being. And by the way, we live in the heart chakra, but that's for another video, just for you to be aware of. So, if we use those chakras as an example and we can identify them by observing that space, its frequency and vibration, and the creations of the spirits that gather there, we can also understand our own chakras and our own major spiritual natures, because we use the ones in the sky as an example to create our own bodies and minds. So, in a way, everybody is sharing spiritual natures, but we're going about them in our own unique way, and we are going further or not as further into those natures. It's like everybody has their own body, but the body is different, right? My face is a little bit different, my nose is a bit different, but we all have human bodies. We all have the same major organs, and also seven major organs: the brain, the heart, the stomach, the lungs, the liver, the intestines, and the kidneys. And those seven organs are a smaller representation of the chakras that we followed, right? So then we can also do some astrological medicine, because each organ represents a spiritual nature, and their function, their routines and patterns are the physical example of those spiritual natures. But that will be for another video as well. Now that we understand that our own bodies were inspired by those big planets, and now that we understand that we kind of share the same spiritual natures, we were attracted to similar spiritual natures, desires, and experiences. It's also important to know that it's important to know about these planets, because those group of spirits and the spirits around us that share the spiritual natures that we copied, or we use it as an example from the big body of spirits, they work with us to create reality. So you as a spirit, you want to be your own creator. You want to create reality in your own way. But you can't do it alone. We must do it with all the other spirits around us. Teamwork makes the dream work. So it's important to know what characteristics, what creations, what frequencies and vibrations the spirits around us are going through, and the spirits that we use as an example are going through as well. For example, when we look at Venus in a natal chart or in the sky, and Venus is in a certain position, we know that Venus represents love, commitment, pleasure, and those characteristics then are used and perceived in different ways based on the position of Venus. But why? And why is that important? First, there is a reason why we have 12 houses and 12 months, because we identified 12 different spaces with major differences, and we create and we behave in different ways in those spaces. Just like when you go to the snow, you behave differently than when you go to the beach, and you wear different clothes. Social environment is different as well. So when Venus, which is the same group of spirits that were attracted to the same characteristics, spiritual natures, and that create mostly similar creations, when it moves into the fifth house, Leo, right? The way we love, the way we commit will be affected, because the father, the example that we used, also changed. And because they are such a big group of spirits, those creations, their influences are massive upon us. But also, not only it's important about the location of Venus, knowing the position specifically of the sun also lets us know where we are as Earth, Gaia, the heart chakra. So by knowing the position of the other planets, we can know our own position and know in which space are we in. So like I said, in the snow, you behave differently than you behave in the beach. So if you are in a different space, we must be aware of it so we know how to create in the best way possible. Now, we have identified that planets basically represent these big spiritual natures. And that's what is our subconscious, is the whole, the entirety, the plethora of spiritual natures that we were attracted into. And then consciousness is us separating, organizing, classifying all those things, all those influences, all those spiritual natures. So astrology is directly connected to our subconscious realm because that's the best way to identify and relate with yourself and the others around you about the major natures and spiritual desires that got us attracted into this place. So, speaking about this place, we are on Earth, on Gaia. So, there are specific reasons, specific desires, and spiritual natures that you were attracted into. And one of them is represented by the color green. Color green is everywhere on this planet, and green usually means growth, patience, support, attraction, transmutation. And then we have the blue color, or the fact that the planet is covered, or the surface of the planet covered in 70% water. So it's about emotions, feelings, understanding your own spiritual natures by reflecting, by swimming around with others in groups, understanding your own movements in correlation to others' movements. So Earth is about emotions and feelings, growing, being patient, being deeper, and being purposeful. But what about the other planets? What they represent in their own way. Now we'll be talking about the major natures and desires that each planet represents. But before we go into that, let's resume the topics that we've been talking about. Your alignments represent your major spiritual natures. We identify and organize those spiritual natures using planets. How do we know what planets tell us anything about our spiritual natures? How do we know what planet represents what? That comes from a spiritual nature and a human perspective. First, let's take a look at the planets that we use to identify spiritual natures. We first have to understand that the planets are chakras, the gathering spots. But what is a chakra or a gathering spot? They are spots where a lot of spirits gather. And why is that important or relevant? Because if spirits gather in specific spots, it means they are similar in natures, and we can identify that space and the group of spirits that gather there by their movements, energy, frequency and vibration, and creations. And if a lot of spirits gather in one place that much, enough to create physical creations on a massive level, it means that the characteristics of those spirits are a huge influence in this system, the solar system. So when we create our minds and bodies in this realm, we use those big groups of spirits as examples to create our own system. So if we can identify the groups of spirits that form planets and understand their characteristics, we can use them as examples to identify our own main groups of spirits, aka chakras, on a personal level. That is important to know because we work together with those groups of spirits to create and interpret reality. So if they have a specific characteristic and influences, those characteristics and influences will affect our experiences, and our own characteristics and influences will affect the spirits' experiences that are around us. So we must know them, those influences, and the creations of those spirits. We must know them to be aware of how to work with these spirits or how to limit certain characteristics or influences from within and from without. Now that we understand the basics, quote unquote, let's get practical. When we explore our natal charts or the sky chart, we are identifying where those groups of spirits are in a specific moment. That's important because they create different creations and influences in different spaces, like how we feel and react different in different places and environments. Also, knowing the position of those big groups of spirits The planets lets us know the position of the group of spirits that we are living in right now, aka Earth, Gaia, Tiamat, wherever. And that let us know the main type of creations and influences that we are creating, surrounded and reacting to the most. Always have in mind that we are creators and co-creators of reality. So knowing how our creative ability is being helped or perturbed is of the utmost importance. After understanding that, let's understand that for many eras, people have been writing and studying about those big groups of spirits, aka planets. We can trust the most common descriptions of those planets across different cultures using the understanding that we are all spirits in bodies sharing a similar experience. So we are by default spiritually aware of other spirits, especially big groups of spirits that influence us heavily. So collectively, we are all aware of those specific characteristics and influences. So it's normal that different cultures came to similar conclusions about those planets. Now that we know how to identify and how we as a civilization and species came into those astrological conclusions, let's understand what planet represents what. So the sun or the groups of spirits that get attracted to form the sun represents uniqueness, individuality, action, expression, ego, and in most cases as well, authority. Mercury represents thinking, communicating, and analyzing in more logical or calculated ways. But depending on your alignment, you might be less calculated. The Earth in itself represents patience, growth, open heartedness, connection, human kindness, the kindness when we see humans caring for each other or animals caring for each other. That's what Earth represents life, growth, support, sustainment. The moon represents reactions, responses, feelings, emotions, and attractions. Venus represents commitment, love, pleasure, and the exchange at fair rates of information and energy. Mars represents passion, motivation, anger, frustration, and deep desires. Jupiter represents wisdom, knowledge, how you and others go about yours and their own testimonies, and the ability to travel spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically. Saturn represents limits and boundaries, structure, organization, discipline, but also sweet, sweet rewards. And then we have Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus escaping away, but Uranus represents change, rebelliousness, opposition, uniqueness, and individuality. Neptune represents grand dreams, grand illusions, grand imagination, grand wisdom and knowledge. Pluto represents transformation, death, and power struggles that your spirit must get into control of to not be tossed around and manipulated by other spirits. And then taking those major spiritual natures, we can identify ourselves. We can identify the group of spirits that we came into this world at this time, and we can understand how we go about those natures because those natures are not really important. What is important is how you do them. How do you react to them? How comfortable are you? How insecure are you? How limited you are? How expanded you are? And then it's important to understand that certain organizations, certain groups, associations, corporations, laws, social etiquettes, sexual attributes, creative attributes, physical attributes, they all come from those natures because we use them as an examples to create our body and the bodies of our societies as well. So this was an introduction, kinda a bit deep, I know, but I hope it was interesting about how astrology helps us understand our subconscious. Because astrology is us identifying groups of spirits in the sky and we use those groups of spirits to create our own minds and bodies. So we share something in common with them, and all those spiritual natures are our subconscious. So if you can identify what we use as an example, we can identify our own subconscious realm. Hope you enjoyed. I wish you the best thoughts, ideas, feelings, and emotion, bunch of individuality, creativity, and responsibility as well. Leave a like and subscribe, book readings with me, and I see you on the next one.